Hi, this is Devin Ratliff from Los Angeles, California. If you're enjoying Low Profile, please consider supporting the show by donating at patreon.com/lowprofile. It also helps a lot when you subscribe and give the show a good rating. And tell your friends. The Morrison family will be forever grateful, and it will help Markley to keep spending time on this work. And now, today's show.
Hey, it's Markley here. Welcome to the 26th episode of Low Profile. As usual, I'm super excited to be sharing a conversation with one of my favorite artists, and today that is Professor David Grubbs. The song you're hearing now is called Banana Cabbage, which he recorded in 1996. His friends in those days jokingly suggested that it sounded like appropriate music to accompany a radio voiceover. And I concur. Over the course of the last 4 decades, David's musical activity has gone from hardcore punk to the fine arts. He's noted for his groundbreaking avant-pop group Gastro del Sol, and his collaborative efforts with a diverse group of influential musicians including the Red Crayola, Pauline Oliveros, Will Oldham, Tony Conrad, Royal Trucks, and even John Fahey. David has also published 3 books in the past decade: Records Ruin the Landscape, about John Cage and early experimental music, and 2 book-length poems, Now That the Audience is Assembled, and The Voice in the Headphones, all available from Duke University Press. He's a professor of music at the City University of New York, and his latest album is an improvised collaboration with the Tokyo-based Taku Unami. I spoke with David about all of this and more in late July. David Grubbs, I'd like to thank you so much for joining me for this episode. It's really cool to have you on the other end of the line here.
Yeah, my pleasure, my pleasure.
Hey. All right, well, great talking to you. I hope you have a lovely night.
Okay.
Just kidding here. I guess I'd like to start by talking about where you grew up. You came from Louisville, Kentucky, is that right?
Uh-huh, that's correct.
What opened the door for you to sort of come into the punk scene? That's kind of where you came up originally, yeah?
Definitely. There had been a scene in Louisville from, 1978, something like that, around the Louisville School of Art. And those folks were all maybe 8 or 10 years older than I was. I was born in 1967, so in 1979 I was 12 years old and reading Rolling Stone magazine because I was really into the Who and the Rolling Stones and things like that, and suddenly had the idea that all of that stuff seemed to have peaked about 10 years prior to that, and I was curious to know, what was going on now. And Rolling Stone would, regularly be writing about, at that point, mainly writing about post-punk. So, I remember features about the Raincoats and the Gang of Four and Public Image Limited and stuff like that, and the Clash. So, I formed a new wave band called the Happy Cadavers when I was in 8th grade. Then hardcore punk kind of swept in, and that seemed like a generational or a sub-generational revelation. And so, and the band that I formed next was called Squirrel Bait.
I feel proud.
Squirrel Bait started when I was 15, and I was 18 when the band broke up. But we put out 2 albums that were on a label called Homestead, and so played with people like Sonic Youth and Big Black and Husker Du, and those were like my absolute favorite bands at the time. So it was kind of a mind-blowing experience.
I can imagine. So we just listened to a little bit of Squirrel Bait, and it seems that now Squirrel Bait has an unofficial line of jeans.
Well, this week I saw that Levi's Vintage, their new campaign, and I guess their new line, explicitly salutes 80s Louisville, Kentucky punk, which
is very specific.
Yeah, I'm as surprised as you are. I'm not quite sure what to say about it. It did, I was totally amused and flummoxed and confused at first, and then I did find out that the art director and a number of people who worked on the campaign went to Louisville several times. Someone from Louisville was able to get them to make a donation to the Louisville Underground Music Archive, which is at the University of Louisville. And some folks that I know actually wound up modeling for the campaign. As far as I'm concerned, the strangest thing was that there was this pastiche recreation of the cover of the first Squirrel Bait record. And that was a surprise to everybody from Squirrel Bait, and Brian McMahon, who's in that photo that was taken when he was 14 years old, of him with a Walkman in his mouth playing it like a harmonica. So anyway, like couple of days worth of amusement, a lot of activity on social media, and then that was about
it. Did you get a pair yet?
No.
No.
I mean, although I've worn Levi's, like 200 days a year for the past 30 years, I guess. So, it's not like, it's not like a tobacco company or a car manufacturer or something like that. It is actually a product that I use in my daily life. But I don't know. Yeah, the whole thing's completely absurd.
Absolutely. Okay. Well. So anyway, after Squirrel Bait, you went on and started another band called Bastro after Squirrel Bait dissolved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Bastro followed immediately out of Squirrel Bait. We continued to make records on the Homestead, and Clark Johnson, who was in Squirrel Bait, was in Bastro as well, and John McIntyre played drums, who later was in Tortoise and the Sea and Cake and Gaster del Sol.
So he's a Louisville guy as well?
No, we met at CBGB's when he was playing drums in a band called My Dad Is Dead, that were on the same bill with Bastro. He went to college in Oberlin, Ohio, which was not so far away. So yeah, we recruited him for Bastro, and I moved to Chicago in 1990, and John moved to Chicago then. So for the last, I guess, 2 years of its existence, Bastro was based in Chicago.
Oh, okay. I was wondering about that, sort of the shift from, because I always knew, specifically, I started with Gaster del Sol,
Mm-hmm.
and knew that came out of Bastro, and was curious about how the sort of transformation happened from the Louisville scene to the Chicago scene, and whether like you brought some of the same audience in from your Bastro following into the new stuff, that new direction with Gaster del Sol.
Yeah, I think it was a lot of. I mean, it was a lot of the same musicians. It was probably a lot of the same audience. It was just people developing and changing and trying different ideas of what it meant to be in a band. So I mean, Bastro was a power trio that did one thing and did it pretty well. And Gastro del Sol, when it first started, it was exactly the same three musicians who were in Bastro. So it was me, John McIntyre, and Bundy K. Brown. But the idea was that it would be open to playing with other musicians, and so Jim O'Rourke became part of the group, and the group could expand to 7 or 8 people for a show, or it could be 2 people for a show. So it really was a kind of flexible concept rather than a group that had like strictly the same membership, and the same lineup for each show.
But where did you come up with that name?
I think because Bastro was morphing into something else, we wanted to morph the name Bastro into something else. And Gato del Sol was a horse that had recently won the Kentucky Derby. So, frequently you can see the names of the 2 parents and the offspring of
Sure.
So, I think Bastro together with Gato del Sol somehow equaled Gaster del Sol.
Oh, that's cool. And kind of bringing in a regional reference into that, too.
I think so, yeah.
Cool. Well, yeah, I was thinking, I was never very familiar with the punk output that you were a part of. And so I spent a little bit of time sitting with that. And for me, when Bastro is sort of coming to a close toward the end there, that's when your sort of very unique style of like kind of lyrical guitar playing started taking shape. Just more like kind of a nice balance of percussive work and very intricate melodic work as well, but uniquely Grubbsian. When I first heard your guitar playing, it really made me want to play guitar more.
Ah, good. I think that's probably a good sign.
Yeah.
Either that, or maybe the best sign is that when it makes people like no, I'm joking. Like give up the instrument entirely. Like, oh, I heard, yeah.
Oh yeah. Maybe like somebody's really into Yngwie Malmsteen.
Yeah.
They
Jimmy
just throw in the
Page.
towel.
Right. I'll never be Jimmy Page.
So with Gaster del Sol, you were talking about being open to collaborators and having more people came in, and then that's when so you have Jim O'Rourke, who made a lot of really nice pop records and a lot of really abrasive, noisy records as well.
Mm-hmm.
You got John McIntyre still in the mix. And then Marcus Pop of Oval comes in and brings this like kind of lush, very early iteration of like kind of glitch music right into your soundscape. He's a German guy. How did you bring Marcus Pop into the fold?
We were touring a lot and playing in Europe a lot. So Jim and I had both met Marcus in Germany. Although I feel like kind of out of the blue he must have sent a record to Jim. But yeah, the Oval stuff when Discount 94 came out, that was I would say that's one of those handfuls of moments of just feeling like, wow, I've really never heard music like this before. Just the very basic building blocks of it. The material that he was using was so different from what almost anybody else was using at the time. So, but that was primarily a long distance collaboration. I mean, we met him several times. I met him in Berlin when I was there with the Red Crayola at one point. But his work on Camaflora was long distance. I don't know. Chicago was a nice hub, and Jim had a studio in his apartment, so, Mats Gustafsson would come in and, we would just record him in Jim's apartment. Or John McIntyre had a studio in the loft where a lot of people from Tortoise lived. So, that's how we recorded Rob Mazurek on Camaflora. So, yeah, people just came through.
Yeah, I had this picture in my mind when I first sort of became aware of the sort of indie scene that wasn't necessarily an indie rock scene.
Mm-hmm.
Me, my perception of it was just that it was this big happy family that was spread across regions and, geographically all over the place. But,
Mm-hmm.
We had like Drag City, Thrill Jockey, Homestead, K, Merge, Touch and Go, all these.
Mm-hmm.
And it just seemed like it was all connected. And do you care to dispel that notion?
It wasn't as interconnected as what you just described. I mean, but the truth of what you just described is that none of this stuff would have happened without the labels, and that the labels not only were artistic entities in their own right, but they were also really, by and large, with a few exceptions, very kind of like ethical operations that inspired one another. So, I mean, Discord Records always had a 50-50 profit share, and as a result, Touch and Go had a 50-50 profit share, and like following in the footsteps of Touch and Go, Drag City and Merge also did a 50-50 profit share. I mean, I've been making records for Drag City for more than 25 years. Never signed a contract with them. Never had any kind of dispute or bad blood with them. It's incredible. Most of the labels that you mentioned still exist, and I think somehow that kind of like ethical core that they all had that really kind of came out of hardcore punk. That these weren't. I mean, some of these labels have made a lot of money, but that's not why they came into existence. And so, yeah, no, I feel like they've all had a kind of strong ethical core. And that, to me, that as much as, musical similarities among artists on the label explain what they have in common with one another.
Another thing on the sort of family perception that I got. So we had the Sea and Cake,
Mm-hmm.
the band, and before that was a band, you had a song in Gastro del Sol.
Yeah, the title came from an example in the dictionary, in the New Collegiate Dictionary, I think it was. If you look up polyphony, which I was looking up, to better understand the musical meaning of the term, but there's also the meaning of the term, the example of one letter that in different contexts provides different sounds. And so the examples that they gave were the Sea and Cake and the Sea and Certain.
And those are two songs.
Yeah, exactly. And John McIntyre had misunderstood the title and thought that it was the Sea, S-E-A, and Cake. And so that's where the band name came from misunderstanding the Gastro del Sol title.
It's a beautiful juxtaposition of words, too, that kind of exemplifies their sound. So you mentioned already working with the Red Crayola.
Mm-hmm.
Chicago
I'm guessing you were a follower of them when you were a teenager.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to have, the older sibling of somebody who I went to high school with was feeding me records when I was in high school. And I was curious at one point about the 13th floor elevators, just about the only thing that I knew, I was probably like a freshman or a sophomore in high school, was, that there was this like 60s Texas garage rock, psychedelic proto-punk scene, and there was this legendary band, the 13th floor elevators. And so I asked this person about the 13th floor elevators, and he said, no problem, I'll loan you those records, but you really ought to listen to the Red Crayola also. And so he loaned me the first two Red Crayola records and Mayo's solo record, Corky's Debt to His Father, which is
Mayo Thompson.
Yeah, which is one of my absolute favorite records. It's an amazing record.
Mine too.
Yeah.
Amazing. So how did you come to make that collaboration happen, or who made that collaboration happen? I guess is a better question.
Mayo was living in Dusseldorf in the early 1990s, and Bastro had played at the Rose Club in Cologne, which is very close to Dusseldorf. And Dietrich Dietersen, who's a German music critic and art critic, and was a friend of Mayo's, was in the crowd and saw us cover Dear Betty Baby from Corky's Debt to His Father. And he came up afterwards and said, like, oh, can I please put you in touch with Mayo? I'm always telling him he needs to, find new musicians who might be interested in playing in the Red Crayola. And so, yeah, Dietrich put us in touch. We spoke on the phone a couple of times. And the next time I was in Germany, I got together with him and worked on songs that eventually were on the self-titled Red Crayola record. And, and I passed along a demo tape to Drag City during a monthly poker game, and said, you ought to really ought to, consider reissuing Red Crayola records, and also committing to releasing new Red Crayola records. And that was not a very difficult thing to convince them of.
I'm glad that happened.
Yeah, me too.
Honestly.
Yeah.
And that's not the first time you reached out to, or you collaborated with, sort of senior masters of the stuff that was influencing you.
Well, Jim and I were playing with Tony Conrad on and off around that time, and Jim and I started a reissue label called Dexter's Cigar that allowed us to release records by Derek Bailey and Mertzbau and Arnold Dryblot and stuff like that. So, yeah, I mean, that definitely brought us into contact with some of the people that we really admired the most.
Slapping Pythagoras was one of the ones that you, at least, that's one of the later Tony Conrad releases.
It's the first new one in Tony's reemergence into playing music in the 1990s. I mean, I know that he had kind of consistently played music, but he became suddenly visible again when Table of the Elements reissued Outside the Dream Syndicate, the record with Faust, and then the first new album that he made after that, I guess 1994, I think, was Slapping Pythagoras, which Jim produced, and Jim and I and a bunch of friends, Kevin Drum and people like that, played on. So yeah, that was super fun, really really great. That was my introduction to Tony. Spending time with him in the studio, and I bowed guitar, but I also played percussion, and he said, for percussion, I just need, I need a low sound and a high sound, and Steve Albini was engineering it, and so we figured out a first baseman's baseball glove hitting a pillow was the low sound, and a guitar cable rolled up and hitting a pint glass was the high sound. Tony was amazing. Just also like incredibly brilliant, wickedly funny person. Yeah, if you haven't seen the documentary Tony Conrad Completely in the Present, I really, really strongly recommend it.
I have not.
Yeah,
so
it came
I'm
out
gonna
just
put
a
that on my queue.
couple of years ago, and was only accessible at at screenings until I don't know, maybe like 3 months ago. I think now it's on most streaming platforms, so it's pretty accessible. But it's great.
Okay.
It's a great documentary.
That's someone I've definitely been curious about for a long time, and just know by a handful of pieces of music.
Right.
And that was your introduction to him personally, or was that your introduction to his music?
It was my introduction to him personally.
Yeah. What got you into the sort of like 20th century composer avant-garde scene, out of coming up from like the sort of hardcore movement? Where did you see the lines begin to blur?
I mean, you just kind of follow your nose, and conversations happen in record stores. College, like raiding college radio libraries is a kind of good way to do that. Also, I remember John McIntyre was in the conservatory at Oberlin, and I remember being amazed when he made a cassette for me that had Yanis Xenakis electroacoustic pieces that were just like totally wild noise. I mean that I had no idea. Like I thought it was classical music. I assumed that that meant that it had to be made with orchestral instruments or something like that. So, I mean, that was the first shock of really hearing this electroacoustic tape music, like Xenakis or Luke Ferrari or people like that.
Yeah, it's crazy. 20th century classical is far removed from the imagery of, like, say, somebody wearing a powdered wig and some blush. I guess you might find that, depending on the scene. I guess you could look at, like, say, Wendy Carlos or someone.
Yeah.
Something like that. But
No, I think the big shock for me though of like, what you might think of as like, contemporary music or like new music or new composed music was hearing electronic music that came out of that tradition, or electroacoustic music, and not having it rely on the more familiar instruments that you would associate with classical music. That was the big shock for me.
Now, so Gastro del Sol, that sort of came to a close in 1998. Is that right?
Sounds about right.
And then Camoufleur came out, and the opening track to that, I kind of want to drop a clip of that here because it's just great, bombastic. It's pop music.
September reverses and the equinox is fleet. Winter slides into fall. When glimpsed in leaps of 9 months, all the seasons reverse. They spring back and they fall forward. They reshuffle when you touch down at the wrong interval.
It's a track that I will confess to liking.
The seasons reverse.
Yes.
No shame in that.
No.
I'll admit I actually like it too.
Oh, good.
Yeah. But the whole record is really beautiful and a nice way to go out. And that's when we sort of see a shift in focus to David Grubbs' solo work. And you had a couple releases before that, as a solo artist, right? We had the
I think there was one banana, cabbage, potato, lettuce, onion, orange. Yeah, that was from the sign from a produce stand in Chicago.
Okay, yeah. Just solo piano.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Very nice, tasteful, paced, sparse, lovely piano music.
I remember friends in Chicago at one point confessing that occasionally they would put it on and do like a mock BBC radio announcer voice over it. and then not long after that, it was used in a BBC radio documentary that has
man.
a BBC radio announcer voice over it. It was a
I actually have
documentary about
written in my
Raymond
notes
Williams.
to do a. It doesn't say BBC, but maybe just do like the recorded intro to this song on top of that music. So I think, I think that's definitely going to happen now.
Good.
And then the Coxcomb, which
That's a really strange record.
Very much. It's sort of a narrative ballad.
Yeah, it's based
Right?
it's based on Stephen Crane's short story The Blue Hotel.
Oh, okay. And it's one song, a little less than 20 minutes.
Yeah, and the narrator is Stephen Prina, who is in the Red Crayola.
Oh, I didn't know he was in that as well.
Yeah.
Okay. I know him from that whole that the Chicago Puddle,
Right.
I guess. Is he a Chicago guy as well?
No, Los Angeles.
Wow. Okay.
But he made a solo record called Push Comes to Love that Jim and I produced, that Drag City released. So he was in Chicago a fair bit.
Yeah, that's a terrific record. I like that one as well. So nice work on the production there.
Thank you.
The Thicket comes out right after Camoufleur, or right around the same time.
Yeah.
I wanted to play a little bit of Two Shades of Blue
Okay.
to sort of illustrate just sort of the direction that you were taking at that time.
Before, after, and still entwined. Two shades of blue. When the wicked space cow appended the candle generator, we saw that a flame in zero gravity is cooler and steadier. A perfectly round flame, a candle in the windlessness, is cooler and more blue.
Did you perform that stuff live with ensembles? Because the albums are definitely a mix of there's just David, and then occasionally we hear input from that some people get together and make some music.
Yeah. I generally toured like with very small groups, like a trio. Noel Aksherte is a French guitar player. Did a number of those tours. Nikos Veliotis, who's a cellist, did a number of those tours. But it would frequently be me and either another guitar or cello and drums. So, relatively small groups.
Now, you've continued making solo and collaborative releases, as we discussed. But in the last, I guess, 6 years, you've sort of been making a footprint as an author as well.
Took me a while to figure out how to do it, but yes. Records Ruin the Landscape was the first book of mine, and that came out in 2014. And then now that the audience is assembled, and The Voice in the Headphones, and I've made a book with Anthony McCall called Simultaneous Soloists. So, yeah, and Now That the Audience is Assembled and The Voice in the Headphones are both book-length poems, and the first two in a series of 3 books. And I'm working on the third and last one using that form right now, and hope, by the end of the year to finish a draft of it.
Excellent. Well, I wanted to start with Records Ruin the Landscape, which is sort of a, it seems like you're sort of just taking the stance of the 20th century avant-garde composers created albums, but that's not necessarily the intended experience of their music per se.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Records for the Landscape is largely about the 1960s and period attitudes towards recorded sound from experimental or avant-garde musicians in the 1960s, where I think John Cage was perhaps, the most important person for setting the terms of that discussion. His disdain for commercially released recordings seemed significant to me because it seemed so different from subsequent generations. Lack of drama around recordings. That people, that recordings didn't seem like such a fatal compromise. But I was really interested in Cage's attitude towards recordings and the way that helped to kind of like shape period attitudes in the 1960s, and how different that was from the period in which I was writing the book 50 years later. So in some ways it's a kind of comparative study of listening cultures about the 1960s and the first couple of decades of the 21st century, and how profoundly different they were from one another.
Then do you think John Cage was laborious over the recording of an album for LP release, or just whatever happens?
No, I think in many instances he took recordings deeply seriously because they were an opportunity for him to work with technology that otherwise he wouldn't be able to do. So like one of the recordings that I write about is the first recording of Cartridge Music, which is a duo of Cage and David Tudor as performers. It's live electronic music. And the album release version is 4 duo recordings superimposed, recorded without reference to one another. So they weren't playing back previous takes and trying to synchronize or respond to those. And so I think that, I mean, it's one of the like really pleasurable paradoxes of this historical material, is that in some ways he just seems very like, almost like comically disdainful, like who would care about records, and yet the records that he made were so unprecedented and and creative and strange, and in most cases he did take tremendous amount of care in making them. And I think that like one of the open secrets also was that he cared deeply how people responded to them, despite having this facade of like, why would anybody like have records in their home?
I want to talk about your long form poem trilogy of
Okay.
which that you brought up here. So Now That the Audience is Assembled is so my experience of it is that I am dropped into the audience at an experimental music performance. I don't know how long it's going to be going on for, what the instrument at hand is going to be, anything like that, and I'm just anticipating. Well, it's kind of like a mystery novel in a way, but it's full of surprises. It's got a lot of humor in it, and also a lot of there's there's pain in there. There's a lot of edge of my seat. A lot of edge of my seat for a 130 something page long poem.
Mm-hmm. It really is intended as a page turner. It's structured as a series of cliffhangers.
What possessed you to write a long form poem about
Lord
attending
knows.
an experimental concert? And you don't have to answer this part of the question, but I wonder if this is based on a concert or if it's accumulation of, many things that you've witnessed or been a part of.
Yeah, I think definitely the latter. So there's not a single concert or artist that that gives a key that explains where all of this comes from. But no, I think that there's quite a bit in the book that consists of things that I've observed just year in year out at concerts.
It really takes you there.
Thank you.
Do you have a copy of that handy?
I do.
I was wondering if you could read us a little bit, and it's from toward the end, so I don't want to give away too much of what happens, but I feel like isolated this really works. It's being told from the performer's perspective, and she walks into a room out of the performance area, and the audience is cheering for an encore. So I'm talking about page 106 here.
Mm-hmm.
And she walks into the room behind the performance space and sees a piano. And I wondered if you could pick it up from there and just read through to page 108.
Sure.
If that's possible.
Of course.
Okay.
Here we go.
And I'll read along with you.
Okay.
Okay.
As the musician moves toward the instrument waiting at the center of the room, the double doors through which she entered swing open and applause shoots forth unmuted, momentarily stakes its claim on her, a brief heterophonous din, and then the doors swing shut. She wheels around and makes eye contact with those sheepish first audience members to attempt an escape prior to the encore. The musician takes an immediate liking to them, startles by blowing a kiss. She has an idea. People will exhaust themselves clamoring for an encore, pack up and leave, and on their way out they'll discover her seated at the piano playing, an encore already begun. Those who would prefer not to suffer through the encore will be the ones who first encounter it, but they're free to keep right on walking. She reflects that someone did her the service of designing and building this instrument. A few scattered chords demonstrate that the tuning is better than anticipated. The audience will soon be exiting en masse, the performance of isolation, absorption, breath, all of a mind focus. Here I am, seated at the piano, looking so grand. Here I am, without a care in the world, seated at the piano and just waiting for the big reveal. I would happily wait forever. This is my instrument. I know where it ends. It will always be my first instrument, and for a time I thought of it as my one instrument, and also as the means of visualizing music. Then I dove into the spaces between keys and learned what's not piano. The piano is neither cello nor blood-curdling shriek. It includes neither pitch wheel nor portamento ribbon. It's not the sonification of data. I know the piano is touch. I turn to the piano as a machine to amplify touch, a machine to flesh out touch. It presses flesh with, it shakes hands with the machinery of my arms, hands, and fingertips. To the extent that I'm free to be ignorant of what I do, it is because of my fingertips, the child in my fingertips.
All right, that's an excerpt from Now That the Audience is Assembled by David Grubbs, and that's out on Duke University Press.
Mm-hmm.
I like that passage because there's, it's kind of mischievous and spur of the moment.
She's an improviser.
Yeah, exactly. Now, how do you feel about your process these days? Are you more inclined to improvisation, composition, or I'm sure there's a balance there, but where do you lean?
As a guitarist, I'm leaning towards improvisation like I never have before. Improvisation for years for me was something that I don't know, kind of aspired towards, but didn't really occupy the right headspace of. And somehow, as an older person now, age 52, I can access that headspace. It just took me a long time.
And your lyrics have long been very, very poetic. Very, you know, you're not sticking to the meter and the, you know, this is gonna rhyme with that other thing. But
I never wrote or published poetry before because I wrote song lyrics. I mean, I really had the medium for that. Mm-hmm. But with these books, just because they're long narrative works, right? They yeah, I couldn't record these texts as song lyrics. Yeah, I found a way to do it that I wasn't able to do before.
This particular book, though, parts of it anyway, did wind up being recorded for an album. Isn't that right?
Yes. Yeah. I was just gonna say I had the idea when I started working on this that it should be a kind of like flexible and multifold kind of text or object. So the text from Now That the Audience is Assembled has been published as a book. There's an album called One and One Less that's with Eli Kessler playing drums and me reading a kind of earlier version of this text. I've made wall drawings from it. Eli and I made a sound installation from it. We've performed it. And that was one of the goals also in writing these long form poems. That really there were many media and modes of performance in which they could be realized.
And we have the next part of the trilogy, which is the latest, is The Voice in the Headphones.
Yep. And
can you just for our listener just kind of spell out the thesis, I guess, the idea behind this one?
The narrative.
You are a professor, by the way, so
yeah. I would say that it has a narrative rather than a thesis, and the narrative is that there's a musician who's frantically trying to finish a film soundtrack over the course of one long day in the recording studio, and the book is really about the culture and the environment of the recording studio and the language of the recording studio. And I found that technical language always very beautiful and very poetic. I mean, there are lots of books that do this, that immerse the reader in a technical language that you hadn't previously encountered. Maybe Moby Dick is the most famous version of this. Like everybody learns a lot about whaling in reading Moby Dick, and maybe people will learn a lot about the recording studio by reading The Voice in the Headphones.
Well, I have spent a lot of hours in recording studios in my day, so I definitely related to a lot of the stuff on here. And
oh, good.
It was especially funny for me, a lot of the observations that you sort of pointed out that maybe a lot of people wouldn't really think about or put into words. I was wondering if you could read me a passage from this book.
Okay.
And if we can turn our textbooks to page 92.
Okay.
And if you see what I'm talking about, I was wondering if you could set this up a little bit and then read this page.
Sure. I would say that this has a lot of similarities to my recollections of Squirrelbait's first recording session. Try to summon the terror of the first recording session, to recall, to experience again the awful uncertainty coloring every aspect of it, except laying it down, killing it, which is the only thing that continues to matter, but how was one to know? who cared what might strike a listener 10 or 20 years down the line? On its maiden voyage, a raft of teenagers powered through the all-important set list, that mnemonic meta-composition of songs, in the sequence in which they were written and imagined appearing on record, the debut album as chronology. Once in the studio, everything did in fact go down first or second take, and after an hour they'd earned a side break. That recording session marked a first time on the clock and a first concern about who knows how we're going to pay for this, even at a soft-spoken hippie's cut-rate basement studio sourced from the Yellow Pages, way out past the suburbs, the vocal booth a nook shoehorned beneath the stairs in which the singer freaks out and strips off his clothes just when the studio owner's jazzer friends stop by and ask, "You cats in the union?"
Now, is that perhaps a little autobiographical?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, okay. That passage always made me chuckle. In this story, there's another band, also in the same studio next door.
Yeah, Studio A. Yeah.
Also scoring the same film. On the same day?
It's my understanding is a little different from that. That this fictional group in Studio A, who had like almost had the success that the main character in the book never really had. They've come together to try to record essentially a reunion record, but that it's gone very badly and they've given it up immediately. So they're kind of killing time and offering their services in Studio B.
Okay, yeah, they do kind of pop in and offer their, critiques and a little bit of input.
Yeah. The familiar faces.
The familiar faces. Yeah. And I had, several ideas pop up of who that could possibly be, but that's part of the beautiful mystery of this story. And I can't wait to read the next installment of this series.
Good. Thank you.
And lately you've been working with someone named Taku Unami?
Yes.
And so tell me about that.
Taku's a friend from Tokyo who I've known for 20 years. I've been really fortunate to play in Japan quite a bit. So, and Taku has played in New York a number of times and plays in Europe periodically. So, yeah, we made a record in Kyoto 3 years ago called Failed Celestial Creatures. And then we've made a second record that just came out this summer on my own label, Blue Chopsticks, which Drag City manufactures. And that record is called Comet Meta.
I listened to this in my backyard on a boombox, and just delightful.
Oh, good.
I got the LP for indoors. It's 90 degrees now, so I don't take my records outside.
Yeah. Wise.
I wanted to ask you again about what's coming up. I followed you on social media for, since we've been in touch at the very least.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you've got some kind of a collaboration with Jan Werner from Mouse on Mars.
Yep. Jan and I recorded in January in Berlin, and we've made preliminary mixes of it. Mouse on Mars have a really nice studio, so we spent three or 4 days there and recorded a tremendous amount of material. So it was really kind of a question of like how to assemble all of this material and what might go with what. But I think we've made those hard decisions. I don't know who's going to release it. We haven't circulated any of it. Maybe it might be nice to try a label that neither of us have worked with before. We'll see. And then the next thing that's scheduled is the second record by The Underflow, which is a trio of me, Mats Gustafsson, and Rob Mazurek. And right after recording in Berlin with Jan, we did a European tour in January. And thankfully recorded most of those concerts. So it's a double album that comes out on Blue Chopsticks in January.
Oh, wow. Of live material.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, drawn from 4 different concerts.
That's exciting.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy about it.
Have you worked with St. Werner in the past?
Yeah, we've played on one another's records before,
Mm-hmm.
but it's the first time that the two of us have, made something, that's...
Like in the same place at the same time?
Yeah, definitely. It's the first time that we've worked in the studio together.
Wow. I can't wait to hear what that energy comes across as. Mouse on Mars is another one of those, just from the whole universe
Yes.
of what I understood as the new psychedelia.
Mm-hmm.
They were definitely a part of that across the pond.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious to hear what y'all did together for an in-person collaboration. That sounds great. And also in the nick of time.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
If we only knew. I mean, so many people would have really gone for their bucket list.
Right. Yeah. I had a pretty good January. In the period right before the shutting down, I was pretty lucky.
David, I think we pretty much did it. I think we've covered a lot of ground, but is there anything else that you'd like to communicate that we haven't touched on?
Not really. I feel like we covered a tremendous amount.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, David.
Yeah. Right back at you. My pleasure.
All right.
Okay, take care.
I'll choose the next. I'll choose whatever's next. I'll choose the near stopping place. The first that fairly shouts, please. Won't catch me back at the place. Place to rest his politics and fails to say grace.
That's Night Errant playing from the David Grubbs album A Guess at the Riddle. If you'd like to hear whatever's next on Low Profile, you can subscribe wherever you find podcasts. Catch you next time.
I'll choose the next. I'll choose whatever's next. I'll choose the near stopping